there's a shift to thinking that getting attacked is now an inevitability, and what do you do to detect that and respond from it once you have been attacked? You go back 10 years, the assumption would have been that if you build the walls high enough, people won't get in. The current assumption is broadly you need to build the walls high enough, but that's necessary but not sufficient, and then you need to detect and recover from people who've got in despite those walls.
So I'm absolutely seeing GDPR being the baseline that other global regulators are looking at. We saw that before with European privacy 20 years ago, became the standard around the world. Absolutely seeing that around GDPR. And it's more interesting than just that. We're also seeing global organizations having to make a decision. Are we going to offer two services, one to Europe and one to the rest of the world? Are we going to offer European standards everywhere? And many organizations are choosing to lift their standards for everything they do everywhere in the world to meet the higher standards that Europe requires. I think that was absolutely one of the goals of the regulation, was to lift the global level of protection as well as the European one. Much of what GDPR requires isn't that unusual. Many of the regulators, many of the customers around the world kind of thought they already had those protections. So I think that means that very few people are looking at the moment to add more than GDPR. There's a lot of work to get to that level to make sure everyone is meeting the standards they were expecting. And what's most interesting is most of the things that's producing noise around GDPR in the industry are actually things that were required in the previous set of rules. So it sort of indicates that many organizations weren't taking this as serious as they should, and that's absolutely been a push from many of these regulators to get people to take it as seriously as they should.
I think in broader financial services regulation, you generally see from European regulators a principles-based approach. Some of the financial services regulation in some jurisdictions is beginning to say things like you must report in X hours, unless there's another regulator with a higher standard, in which case you must meet that with us as well. So there is here's our standard, but if someone else holds you to a higher standard, you must meet that in our jurisdiction as well, beginning to creep into some of the regulation of financial services, which is challenging.
You have to understand what these regulations are, so that involves a lot more sensing and monitoring the environment, and many of these things are a surprise to organisations, so it's worth getting involved earlier to see what's coming down. So there's sensing what's happening, there's then taking a risk-based view. It is unlikely that you can consistently comply with every rule everywhere. That would indeed be gold plating. So how then does the organisation pick? Increasingly now there's a requirement to document those choices, because those choices are being challenged afterwards. So sensing, taking a risk view, and then absolutely execution and implementation is the core thing here.
It's sometimes in organisations' interest to engage early with the regulator and say, come and test us first, because two things: you learn faster than the rest of your peers, frankly, if you get in front of that, and you get some, I would say, a higher level of forgiveness from the regulator if you are actively volunteering to go first and try to comply with this regulation. It's a really good statement about how seriously you take this stuff and how well you try and govern cyber.
One of the challenges is some of the regulation that comes from financial services is sort of designed for the levels of investment, the kind of industry that financial services operates in. When that gets copied and moves into other industries, there can be a little bit of a disconnect with their expectations of the same kind of base capabilities, capacity that can be challenging in other areas. I think the regulators have reflected carefully on what's different in organisations who do take this seriously and make significant progress, and those who perhaps have the resources but it doesn't seem to get applied in the right places. This combination of reality and senior accountability is a very good way to get things to actually move forward. The regulation itself has massive fines as a mechanism to get people to pay attention. I think we're unlikely to see the regulator enforcing that in that kind of way initially. They're making much more sensible noises about engagement. We discussed in the talk, one of the things they're planning is a regulatory sandbox for privacy issues. We can go and try out new and emerging technologies with the regulator, so you can sort of embed their thinking, rather than sometimes historically you'd build something, roll it out globally, and the regulator go, hang on, that's completely abusive and wrong, and that's not helpful for anybody. There's the threat of fines, even if not likely to arrive in the short term, has been useful to get people to pay attention, and then that coupled with a sensible engagement and understanding within organisations what they need to do, those together get people moving in the right direction quite rapidly.
The regulators generally come up with new regulation by firstly talking to organisations about what good looks like within those organisations, and then secondly, typically they have some fairly, particularly in Europe, some fairly robust consultation with industries to make sure the regulation is appropriate, proportionate and right. It's not that regulators are coming up with stuff because industry aren't doing it. The regulators are taking good stuff that industry are doing, try to codify it as a minimum standard, and then before they are enforcing that as such, they are going back to industry and saying, what do you think, what are the faults with this, etc. So in some ways, I think regulation coming out isn't a sign that things haven't been done properly, it's a sign that things are being done properly, and they're just trying to get that good practice to spread.
6 months ago, I would have said there's a very clear distinction. We see around the world very different cultural views to privacy. Even within Europe, it's one of the areas where, say, UK and Ireland have quite a different view than some of mainland Europe, but at least there was enough to get a common consensus around GDPR. And it's been quite fascinating over the last few weeks to start seeing talk at relatively senior levels of politicians in the US about having some kind of privacy rights and regulation, which is very different than the historic view where this was a commercial, it was a contract between customers and the organisation, and hence was in their world to manage. I think some of the recent events have led to a bit more attention on this. I'm not sure where that will unfold. It will be fascinating to watch, but we'll definitely see GDPR as the standard for most of the world. I guess it'll be a key decision point about how the US deal with that in time.
CISOs need some kind of horizon scanning and sensing mechanism, right? My view is a CISO apps, they're not going to scour every single website personally for all the stuff. They need to be plugged into whether it's conferences, whether it's their own horizon scanning operation, but they need a way of seeing what's coming down the pipe so they can get ahead of it. CISOs in many industries are putting more effort into building that kind of horizon scanning capability. They know what the regulators are thinking, and therefore they're expecting to turn up in 18 months' time rather than be surprised when it does. Horizon scanning and engagement with the wider cyber and regulatory ecosystem, if you like, are the two critical pieces there.
We've always had this question, should the CISO be in IT, should they not be in IT? And this is one of those examples where if you're just talking to IT people, you're probably not seeing this kind of horizon. Okay. This is one where engaging with the legal team, with the compliance team, with the senior directors of the organisation to understand their view of risk. That's what's making the CISO role so fascinating at the moment, is it is blossoming into this much broader set of responsibilities, much wider network it needs both within the organisation and externally to be successful in this space.